Let me first say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We're happy to welcome you to today's presentation of results from the Midline survey of the second iteration of the Strengthen PSMP Institutions and Resilience, or SPIR-2 RIFSA, implemented by World Vision in Amhara and Oromia regions of Ethiopia. My name is Tom Spangler, and I work with Save the Children as Activity Director for the Impel Associate Award. I'll ask Karina to paste a link in the chat box to a 2-page brief that provides a bit more detailed information on our activities. Some of you will know that the overall purpose of Impel is to conduct both performance and impact evaluations and facilitate knowledge sharing to improve the design and implementation of BHA-funded resilience food security activities, or RIFSAs. And today's presentation will be led by the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. IFPRI is not only an Impel research partner, but they also work directly with World Vision as the learning agenda lead for the SPIR-2 RIFSA. And in both these roles, IFPRI draws on their extensive experience designing and conducting rigorous research on food and livelihood security programming throughout Ethiopia. I'll pass it first to Jessica Late, Research Fellow in the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division at IFPRI, who will then introduce her colleagues on the research team. They'll be giving an overview of the SPIR-2 program and evaluation design, including methods used, as well as results from the Midline survey. They'll also respond to any questions you might have about the findings, but have asked that they be given time to do that after they've completed the presentation. So for anyone who has questions during the presentation, we ask that you use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to enter your questions so that we can efficiently answer as many questions as we have time for today. Finally, I'll say that today's presentation and Q&A will be recorded, but not disseminated externally. We're only doing this for Impel and BHA reference and will not share the recording publicly. So again, we thank you for joining us today. And with that, I'll pass it off to Jessica to get us started. Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, for the introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Good morning and good afternoon. As Tom said, my name is Jessica Light. I'm a research fellow in the Poverty, Gender, and Inclusion Unit and one of the researchers leading this evaluation. I'll be presenting the first part of the results, and then my colleague, Kale Hironen, will pick up. He's a senior research fellow in development strategy and governance, and our colleague Dan Gilligan, who is also collaborating on this project, and the lead at Poverty, Gender, and Inclusion is also on the call and might participate in the Q&A. So thank you again. We are presenting midline findings from the Impel evaluation of the SPIR-2 RIFSA. Next slide, please. So we'll begin with a study motivation and overview of our study.
Can you remove something?
No, that's mine.
Why is this thing not working?
Mute, please. If everyone in the audience could mute, that would be great.
Hey, all, if you're on the line, if you would mute your phones, thanks so much.
Awesome. So we'll begin with an overview of the study motivation and design. This section will be somewhat more compact since I believe the motivation and design are familiar to many in the audience, but of course we're happy to take clarifying questions as needed. And then we'll provide an overview of the data collection and the results from this round of data. Next slide, please. So just a general background, the second phase of Strengthen PSMP Institutions and Resilience, or SPIR-2, aims to enhance livelihoods, increase resilience to shocks, and improve food security and nutrition for rural households vulnerable to food insecurity in Ethiopia. The impact evaluation that we're presenting on here employs an experimental design. We have multiple treatment arms comparing combinations of livelihood and nutrition graduation model programming provided to PSMP beneficiaries relative to a control group that receives only PSMP transfers and no supplementary programming. Next slide, please. I'll describe the evaluation design in more detail. This is a cluster randomized controlled trial. The cluster is defined as the Kabele, thus all randomization is at the Kabele level. And the target sample included 237 Kabeles in Amhara and Oromia in which SPIR-2 is operational. This is not the full SPIR-2 area, which is about double this size, but a subset of Kabeles that were identified as appropriate for the evaluation, largely based on their absence of previous exposure to other evaluation work that was conducted as part of SPIR-1. Again, we have 3 arms. The first study arm, we'll call T1, serves as a control group of PSMP households against which the impacts of SPIR2 programming will be measured. These households, of course, receive the core PSMP transfers. They do not receive other supplemental programming at the household level. In arm T2, PSMP households benefit from core SPIR2 programming. We'll describe that more very shortly, and the nurturing care groups intervention. And the study arm T3 receives the same intervention package as households in T2 and also receives maternal grants. Next slide, please. Here's a graphical summary of the same information. You can see T1 on the left, T2, and then T3. So T2 adds SPIR2 and nurturing care groups, and T3 adds SPIR2 nurturing care groups and maternal grants. Next slide, please. The multi-arm design is tailored to allow us to evaluate the causal impact of both livelihood and nutrition graduation programming in SPIR2. We can compare outcomes in T1 to T2 and T3 to assess the impact of livelihood-related programming on outcomes such as financial inclusion, assets, consumption, resilience, and poverty. And by comparing outcomes across 3 arms, we can focus more specifically on the effects of the nutrition interventions, the nurturing care groups, and grants on IYCF practices and child growth outcomes, e.g. child stunting prevalence, with and without the added maternal grant, which of course was only in T3. Next slide, please. Let me describe the nurturing care group in somewhat more detail, though I know it, again, it's familiar to many in the audience. So the nurturing care group model has been pioneered by World Vision and other contexts. It's based on groups of 10 to 15 community-based trained volunteer agents who cascade down behavioral change counseling messages and activities to caregiver groups at the community level. There are some non-experimental studies also conducted outside of Ethiopia that suggest this model can significantly increase BCC contact rates vis-a-vis more traditional models relying on health workers, for example, and thus can improve IYCF practices and child growth outcomes. However, large-scale experimental evidence on the effectiveness of this strategy is largely unavailable, and that's what we're seeking to provide here. Next slide, please. Let me describe the study design and the timing of the survey rounds. Given that we're particularly interested in evaluating the effects of the nutrition interventions, we've timed the survey rounds to fit a very precise timeline of child growth and development. The baseline survey was conducted in August, September 2022. We presented on this previously, and in baseline, we sampled both women who were pregnant and those having an infant in the household up to 9 months. The midline survey was then planned for August, September 2023. There was a slight variation in this timing that I'll describe more shortly due to conflict-related conditions. And at that point, the children who were sampled in utero or in infancy at baseline would then be 6 to 23 months. This is an ideal time to measure IYCF practices as it corresponds to the period in which complementary foods should be introduced. And then looking ahead to the endline survey, that will be August, September 2025. The children will then be 30 to 48 months. This will be an ideal point at which to measure anthropometric and other child health outcomes, given that at that point, the children will be past the point where usually a major catch-up in stunting is observed. Next slide, please. The eligibility criteria for the baseline survey, just slightly more detail. First, of course, the household had to be enrolled as a PSMP beneficiary. Second, the household had to meet one of the following conditions. There was a pregnant woman present who self-reported pregnancy in the 2nd or 3rd trimester. We did not conduct pregnancy tests. This was based on self-reports. Or there was an infant present aged less than 9 months as of the date of survey, again, based on parental reports, resident in the household with his or her mother or primary caretaker. The target sample was 13 households, and we sought to have essentially an even split, 7 households with a pregnant woman, 6 with an infant. Next slide, please. Data collection. As I noted, the baseline survey was in 2022. We interviewed both the primary female respondent, who would be the pregnant or lactating woman, and her spouse. The Midline survey was planned to be exactly 12 months post-baseline to preserve a consistent seasonality. In Oromia, the survey was conducted according to plan. In Amhara, due to widespread conflict in this period, the survey launched later in early October, and the first phase of survey work concluded in mid-November, encompassing 68 out of 80 kabiles. The remaining 12 were still inaccessible at that point, and the survey team was then finally able to return and conduct surveys in those final 12 kabiles in December 2023. So there is a slight difference in timing, and the children of interest would be slightly older by about 2 to 3 months in the Amhara sample. That being said, when we randomized, we did stratify at the woreda level, meaning within each woreda, we have both treatment and control kabiles. Thus, the difference in timing across regions wouldn't be a source of bias for our primary findings. Next slide, please. Future data collection at Midline will be around 24 months following the midline, all households visited, and interviews with both the primary female respondent and her spouse. I don't believe I explicitly noted this, but at the midline that we're reporting on today, we only surveyed the female respondent and conducted anthropometric measurements on the children. So there were no surveys of the male spouses. At the midline, we aim to recontact all 3,015 households interviewed at baseline, and in fact, we reached 98%. So attrition was very, very low, about 2%. Next slide, please. However, within the households that we successfully contacted at midline, there was some variation as to whether we found the child that we expected to find. Among households we enrolled at baseline with an infant, 97% still had the child present. The 3% where the child was not present were cases either where the child had passed away or the child and caregiver had relocated to another household. This was very rare. However, among the households that we enrolled at baseline with a pregnant woman, where of course we would now expect to find an infant, we found, particularly in Oromia, only 60% of pregnant women enrolled households had an infant present when we revisited that household at midline. And Amhara was higher, 83%, but still far from 100%. In principle, you would expect almost everyone pregnant at baseline to have a child, except in cases of miscarriage or stillbirth or infant mortality. In fact, what we do seem to see is a very high rate of miscarriage. That's what the vast majority of these households reported, that they had been pregnant and had subsequently had a miscarriage. There is also some households, we believe, based on anecdotal reports, might have feigned pregnancy at baseline. But ultimately, we cannot conclusively determine what is the reason that an infant is not present. It could be either of those factors, but the miscarriage rate does seem to be quite high. We also exclude 167 households due to child age. These were households where we expected, based on baseline data, the child should be in our target age range of 6 to 23 months. But when we returned at midline, we had slightly different information provided about their age, and the child was outside that age range. That results in a sample of 2,233 children. Again, just to repeat the number, our original baseline sample was 3,015 households. We visited almost every household at midline. Thus, we have data on household outcomes for almost every household. But the sample of children will be smaller because some households did not have a child present. Next slide, please. Exposure to SPIR interventions. I'll now just briefly summarize what we saw in household self-reports about their participation in the interventions of interest. The livelihoods interventions in SPIR center around the formation of VESAs. We observe a high participation in both T2 and T3. About 60 to 70% of households are participating in VESAs. There's also some reported participation in T1, that's about 16%. That could either be some similar savings group created outside of SPIR, or perhaps a misunderstanding about what the question was referring to. Next slide, please. Livelihoods grants. So by design, the poorest 1/3 of households in T2 and T3 were eligible for one-time $300 livelihoods grants. This is not for all households. And we find that self-reports are very consistent with this targeting. So about 35 to 38% report receiving such a grant. In the T1, minimal reports of any grant receipt. And in a separate question, we asked households what they used the livelihoods grant for among those who received it. They were reported to primarily be used for livestock-related activities. Next slide, please. The neighborhood groups are the platform in which behavioral change communication is delivered on the NCG model. Again, we find self-reported participation in treatment arms is high, is 75 to almost 90% in T3. That's very encouraging. We again see a much lower level of reported participation in the control arm, but this seems to reflect a comprehension error, as many of the caregivers report that these group sessions were led by a health extension worker. So neighborhood groups are not led by a HUE, they're led by peer lead mothers. It seems that the women in T1 might have had in mind some sort of BCC or educational session conducted by a health extension worker. Next slide. The maternal grants. So again, the maternal grants were only offered in T3. Again, we see very high fidelity, 93%. And the average maternal grant recipient reported receiving 7 transfers. The mean amount of the latest transfer reported to be 1,477 per. The maternal grant is intended to be bi-monthly, so given a 12-month period, this is exactly on target. And the vast majority of respondents, over 80%, report that they're using the grants for child feeding related costs. Next slide. So I will stop here and pass it over to Kale. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So I'll be talking about nutrition outcomes now. So we'll be using the sample of children for the analysis. I'm just going to briefly talk about this theory of change in a very simplified terms. So we have the intensive behavioral change communication, which we would expect to improve caregiver knowledge when it comes to child feeding. And this would then result into improved infant and young child feeding in this context. And it would improve infant and young child feeding. We hope to see less linear growth faltering or stunting. So this is the theory of change in a very simplified term in T2 arm. In T3 arm, we add the maternal cash transfers to the mix. So there, the idea is that maybe households, the caregivers will see improvements in their knowledge, but they are still too poor to purchase these nutritious foods. So there we're addressing, or the implementer is addressing, 2 different constraints at the same time, related to knowledge and related to unaffordability of these nutritious foods. And the timing of the assessment is very critical in this study. So we are measuring caregiver knowledge across all rounds, but then really the focus of this midline is to understand whether there's been an improvement in infant and young child feeding, and these children are now between 6 to 24 months of age, so this is the ideal time to measure them. And then moving on with the theory of change, we expect to see less linear growth faltering if these previous conditions have been met, and this will be primarily assessed at the end line when the children are 30 to 48 months of age. We did measure anthropometrics in the midline and we'll be reporting them, but the real test, so to speak, is at the end line. So starting from the first part of the theory of change, caregivers' nutrition knowledge. And this is a bit messy graph, so I'll talk you through it. So here we have 3 bars. Each one represents the average for the group, the T1 or the control group, T2 where SPIR and nutrition care groups, and then the T3 that has the care groups and the maternal cash transfers as well. The dark blue bar measures the nutrition knowledge score at the baseline, and the light blue that in combination with the dark blue measures the amount, the score in the midline, so that the light blue is basically the difference between midline and end line. And this nutrition score is constructed from a quiz that we administer to the caregivers, female caregivers in this round. And this basically tested the knowledge that they should have acquired through this nutritional care group intervention, but also some of the knowledge they might have acquired from the standard behavior change communication that is provided by the health extension workers. So what we see here is that if the maximum is 12, we see that the way this has been constructed and administered this test, that there's quite high knowledge of this infant and child feeding practices in general. We see improvements over time across all food group, all treatment groups, and this could be because these children are now a little bit older, so the parents acquire more knowledge as the children age. But we also see here that when we compare T1 against T2 and T3, at the baseline, the differences were very small and not statistically different from 0. But at the midline, we start to see these differences emerging. So T2 and T3, the means are somewhat higher than the means in T1. So basically, there is some suggestive evidence here that the knowledge has improved more in these treatment groups. But again, these differences are not very large. And so there are 2 points is that to highlight here is that the knowledge seems to be quite high, and perhaps we should have administered a more difficult questionnaire or quiz to tease out these differences in a better way. But anyway, so there's improvement in nutritional knowledge, and these differences are statistically significant, somewhat small though. Then moving on the theory of change, we have an indicator capturing the share of children consuming a diet of minimum diversity. And this is based on counting food groups that the child has reported to have consumed in the previous 24 hours in the midline interview. And the idea is that including breast milk as one food group, that the child meets this threshold if they have consumed from 5 or more food groups. When we look at this across these study arms, about 13% in the T1 arm meet this criteria, 14% in T2 arm, but then in T3 arm that receives the cash transfers coupled with the behavioral change communication through the nutrition care groups, there the share is much higher, nearly 30%, 29%. And these differences between the T3 arms to the other arms are statistically significant, whereas the difference between T1 and T2 arms are not, or is not. We can look at a little bit more of the composition of these diets by looking at these food groups. So here's percent of children consuming from different food groups that underlie this indicator that I presented in the previous slide. So virtually all children receive breast milk and graze, roots, and tubers, but the differences between the T3 and the other arms emerge when it comes to dairy product consumption of dairy products, and particularly eggs, and they're much more likely to have consumed eggs in the previous day than the children in the other arm. Meal frequency is another way of looking at this infant and young child feeding practices. And there are different ways. The calculation depends a little bit on whether the child is being breastfed or not. But we see here that when it comes to this indicator, it looks much better than when it comes to dietary diversity. So nearly 60% of the children in the T1 arm meet this minimum meal frequency requirement. T2, it's about 61%, and T3 somewhat higher, in almost 68%. And again, the differences between T3 and against the 2 other arms is statistically different from 0. When we combine the minimum dietary diversity and minimum meal frequency into one indicator, we get this minimum acceptable diets. So if the child achieves the minimum meal frequency and minimum dietary diversity, it achieves the minimum acceptable diets. And here again, we see the similar picture. Children in the T3 arm much more likely to have met this requirement than the children in the other 2 arms. Moving on to anthropometric outcomes, just a kind of brief reminder that we're measuring this using Z-scores. So here's the height for a Z-score, which is basically we compare the height of the same age and sex child to a reference standard composed of children of the same sex and age. And just a kind of quick overview of the theory here is that a child is considered stunted if his or her height for a Z-score is less than -2. So in a healthy and well-nourished population, the distribution looks something like this, where there's is standardized to 0, and then less than 3% of the children have a height for a Z-score that is below -2. So if we look at another population and we compare the situation, we can start to understand the nutritional situation when we look at the stunting prevalence. If it's considerably higher than this, it suggests that there are nutritional problems. And this is exactly what we see in this slide here. We basically compare these distributions in the height for Z-scores across these 3 arms to the reference. And we see here that the share of children who are stunted is much, much higher across all these 3 arms that you would expect in a healthy and well-nourished population. Moving on to then showing the mean height for Z-score for children, we see here that there's the variation across the 3 arms is not very large. The means are -1.6 across the 3 arms roughly, but there's a statistical difference when we compare the T2 and T3 arms, but these differences are very small. When we look at stunting, we see that in the T3 arm, the stunting rates are somewhat lower than in T1 and T2. In T1, it's about 37% of the children in this age range are stunted. In T2, it's 38%, and T3 is 35%. And the difference between the T2 and T3 is statistically different from 0. Moving on to weight per height Z-score and wasting, these are more indicators of acute undernutrition, where stunting and height per height Z-score were indicators more of a chronic nature. Here we see a similar story, not major differences, although the difference again looks like that the T3 is doing somewhat better when it comes to a mean weight per height. In terms of wasting, it seems this T1 arm for some reason has a lower rate of wasting than the T2, but the difference between T1 and T3 is not statistically significant. Moving on to then early childhood development, we measured, we had an indicator that we used in the survey using this CREDI measure, which is a kind of a quick and simple way of understanding early childhood development. And so we administered that module in the survey. And this requires only around 5 minutes, so it was quick to do. So these are kind of item-specific questions showing pictures of for their parents to ask whether they can do this and that, for example, standing and walking if they're very small children. And these are age-specific, so about 6 months, 5 month intervals that we're asking them for. What we do then is that we standardize it so that for the T1, the control arm, we standardized their mean to be 0 with standard deviation and 1, and then we compare this measure against the other 2 arms. So we see here that the children in the T3 arm score much better in this early childhood development indicator than the other 2 arms. And the difference between T3 arm is about 0.2 standard deviations. So moving on to livelihood outcomes. So the SPIR livelihood programming includes, as Jessica told us, explained us that this formation of Village Economic Savings Association, they use this as a platform to provide training and other types of activities related to financial literacy and so forth. And a subset of households received this one-time $300 livelihood grant. So in assessing impact on livelihood outcomes, we pooled the two treatment arms, T2 and T3, together to maximize statistical power, and this was according to the pre-analysis plan that we agreed upon. At this point in Midline, we do not expect to see meaningful impacts on livelihood outcomes because it's been such a short period since the intervention began, and these outcomes takes a little bit longer to see impacts on. So the main impact evaluation will take place at the end line. So we are tracking a couple of food security indicators, food insecurity experience scale, which is a series of yes and no questions about households' food security situation in the past 12 months. And then we aggregated up to an index. And then we have food consumption score, which is basically an indicator that captures dietary diversity and consumption frequency at the household level with the recall period of 7 days. It's worth noting that previous literature, and we do as well, find that these indicators predict very different levels of food insecurity. So the PS, the first one, tends to predict much higher food insecurity than the FCS, and we can go into those details, but I think we touched upon this at the baseline already. So here we are looking at these comparisons between T1 arm, which is the control arm, and the pooled T2 and T3 arms, which are the treatment arms. Here we measured this at the baseline and midline, so we can look at the trends as well as these differences across the arms. So we see here that share of households that are moderately food insecure. Sorry, let's start from the right-hand side. So the share of households that are severely food insecure has fallen over time in this sample, but the differences in the trends are not statistically significant between the two treatment arms, the two study arms. And a lot of these households that were severely food insecure have moved into this other category, moderately food insecure. And there we see this increases in the share of households in that category. But again, these trends are not different across these two study arms. We can look at the food consumption score. We can look at it in terms of raw score. And we see here that if the mean at the baseline was already above the acceptable threshold when it comes to food consumption score. We see when we move to midline, we see that this has improved for both household groups, but then it's slightly more among the treated households, and the difference is about 4 food consumption score units. So we can categorize also households based on this indicator. In the acceptable, we see that majority of the households already at the baseline based on this indicator had acceptable levels of food security, and the share has improved over time and has increased more among those households in the treatment group. Moving on to consumption and poverty. So in baseline and midline, we asked a series of questions about household consumption when it comes to food and non-food items. And we can use these data to assess households' consumption levels and estimate poverty levels as well. And so to do so, we convert the consumption amounts first to 2011 BIR terms, and then we apply purchasing power parity conversion factors so that we can compare this to the international poverty line of $1.90 PPP dollars. And this is based on 2011 PPP exchange rates. So the poverty head count is the share of individuals whose household consumption is below this threshold. So starting from consumption levels, we see that the household daily per capita consumption has fallen over time among both groups. It has fallen a little bit less among the treated households than when it comes to the control households. The difference is small, but it says not statistically significant, but it is actually statistically significant. Poverty head counts, so the share of individuals whose household consumption falls below this poverty line, we see that the poverty has increased over time, a little bit less among the treated households. But at the midline, nearly 80% of the households are below the poverty line. And I should say here that when it comes to these consumption outcomes, so we have pooled these two arms together, and we do some additional analysis in the midline report. So some of these positive trends that we're documenting here are driven by the households in the T3 arm who are also receiving the maternal cash transfer. So that might be explaining these results in the midline a little bit. So in terms of summary, as Jessica noted, the project displays high implementation fidelity, which is great. We didn't get to talk too much about context, but as anyone who is following Ethiopia lately, and particularly this region of Amhara, this is a quite volatile context. The poverty rates among this sample are very high, and these constitute quite major challenges and may undermine the project's impact on livelihood and nutrition outcomes. So the context is very, very challenging in which this project is being conducted. We do see, despite this volatility, significant improvements in infant and young child feeding practices among households in areas where these maternal cash grants are taking place in combination with other SPIR interventions. So considering the theory of change, this emphasizes the necessity of addressing both caregiver knowledge and resource constraints to enhance child diets and feeding practices in this setting. Overall, the findings present promising prospects for seeing positive impacts on children's anthropometric outcomes at the end line when we're actually primarily testing them. So 1 year into the implementation, it's too early to assess the impacts on livelihood outcomes. So the real test, again, is at the end line. That's all. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Kale. I do see that we have some questions. We have questions entered both in the chat and some in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to take these in order in which they were asked. But of course, Kale, Jessica, you can see the questions as they're posed in the Q&A as well. I think the first one we got was from James, and he was asking, it appears that there are no significant differences as regards to the caregiver's knowledge of the nutritional requirement between the treatment groups. And I was wondering if you could revisit that and maybe offer some explanation.
Sure, I can comment a bit on that. And I'll just note there were in the chat a couple of follow-up questions on that as well, that I can address at the same time about more questions and what other tools. So
Please do,
yes,
Jessica, go ahead. Rather than me asking those, just address them as you're able. Thank you.
it seems like that we can bundle those together. So yes, it's correct that there are largely minimal differences across the treatment arms. And so it seems that based on the measures we have, even households in T1 that weren't participating in the nurturing care groups, in the neighborhood groups rather, have access to information through other channels. There is a caveat that our nutritional questions may have been a bit easy. We did aim to align them with the curriculum that was included in the BCC, but we might have missed some of the more advanced domains. So we are planning at Inline to repeat these questions, but also extend with some more advanced questions to see if we can detect then differences in knowledge and the higher types of nutritional knowledge. Per Beryl's question about what type of tool, we have not yet determined this. We're open to suggestions. We, I think, anticipate probably developing the questions ourselves so we can tailor them specifically to the neighborhood group's curriculum, but we could also consider some existing tools. And in terms of other questions to understand the reasons for such a result, I think the other question would be where are caregivers obtaining information in general, as clearly they are obtaining at least this information. So we could potentially consider some additional questions along those lines at Inline. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much, Jessica. I think just continuing related to this topic somewhat, Sarah asks a question. Were the households without an eligible child at midline equally distributed between the three arms? And was the data for the households without an eligible child retained in the analysis for all non-child nutrition related indicators? Will these households be included in the inline or dropped from the sample?
Maybe I'll take that. So I think the way I understand the question is that we have this two-pronged sampling strategy. At the baseline, we sampled households with pregnant women, and then we expected to see an infant child at the midline. And then the other part of the sample was formed of infants who were already born at the baseline, and then we followed them at the midlines. And the challenge there was that what we observed in the midline is that a large share of these households that's reported to have a pregnant woman midline, a sizable share, at least particularly in Oromia, didn't have a child when we came during midline in the age range that we expected. So the second part of the question is an easy one. So when we looked at these other outcomes, livelihood-related outcomes, we retain the whole sample of households. But when we look at the nutrition-related outcomes, we restrict the sample to households that have a child at midline in the eligible in the age range that we expect them to be in between 6 to 23 months of age. Whether these differences are when it comes to the child level attrition are different across the study arms, I need to double check, but I'm pretty sure that there were no differences across the study arms. They were equally likely to have happened across the study arms.
Thank you very much, Kalle. Jessica, if you have anything to add, please do. And I want to encourage others, if you want to try to clarify your question, feel free to come off mute and pose it yourself. Otherwise, I will read those that are listed here. Another question that we have, let me see, I think is from James. And there's some related questions. Jessica, maybe you've already addressed this. If so, if you could clarify it again. Cooling T2 and T3 treatments will seem to introduce some effects of multicollinearity and lead to biases in terms of isolating the effects of treatment effects. And James's question is, how did you handle or did you intend to address this?
Sure. So we had pre-specified that we were going to pool them for the livelihoods outcomes because the core livelihoods interventions are the same. And the only interventions that differ across T2 and T3 are nutrition focused. I don't see that there's any particular risk of multicollinearity, but we do acknowledge that we are obviously missing some detail in terms of the effects of each arm. We have explored the effects by arm, and I believe they're in the report, if that's correct, Kalle. So you can review them there. And I can inform you that we do see some heterogeneity. So in the arms where the grants were received, we do see larger effects on food security. So it does seem like the receipt of the grant is boosting other household outcomes in addition to the child nutritional outcomes that we presented here. But we have focused on the pooled results here to be consistent with our pre-specified analysis.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. And you can see questions are continually streaming in, so I'm going to do my best to pick these off, but Kalle, Jessica, please do take a look at those and see if there are any that you'd like to spend more time on. I think one that came up next was again from Beryl, asking, apart from the use of grants for feeding, what other uses did you observe among the remaining 17% of the caregivers, other uses for those grants?
So there's a graph in the Midline report. I cannot access it now because I'm sharing the screen, but on the top of my head, I think the second most common category that they used was household food consumption. So again, not very different from the original, the first category, which was focused on child feeding.
Medical care also, I think, was highlighted, like out-of-pocket costs related to medical visits.
But it's clear that the caregivers, based on their self-reports, seem to have prioritized child feeding, although it was not conditioned for that use. Although I think it was recommended, but not said that you have to use it for it.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Another question, were you able to further analyze the factors that led to better ECD outcomes in the T3 arm, other than the cash grant?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the short answer is no, we didn't include a parenting practices module in this round that would examine parental interactions with the child, forms of stimulation, potentially forms of discipline. These children are still very young, so some of those concepts may still have limited applicability in this period, but I think that would be the key area that we would want to look at, since many interventions that have shown large effects in ECD focus on that type of parental behavior as a key term. So we plan to do that at Midline. It's perhaps worth noting, just in light of many of the questions that are coming in, we report in this presentation on virtually all of the major modules in the survey. The survey was designed to be relatively short, much shorter than the baseline and Midline. So by and large, there isn't any major result that we haven't referred to. The domains that we haven't discussed here are largely going to have to be domains that we measure at Midline.
Yeah, maybe just to add that the main, or perhaps the only difference between T2 and T3 arms is the maternal cash grants. So I think an educated guess is that this could be related to child feeding that was improved as a result of these cash grants. But
that's definitely true. And maybe if I can just add one more point, in our qualitative formative work, one point that had been highlighted related to cash constraints is also that mothers then are engaged in various types of petty training on trading and other economic activities, and that limits their time available with the child. The child is cared for by others, or they have to feed the child very quickly and move on to their other activities. So the cash could also translate into more time available for the mother to perhaps spend time with the child, feed him or her more carefully, which is what I sort of had in mind when I said parenting practice.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to continue to pick these off in the time that we have. I think a next question is whether poverty is measured through consumption expenditure only. And it's not exactly clear to the questioner why poverty increased, and if you might have any other insights as to why.
Yeah. So this is the graph that's under question here. So yes, poverty is measured using consumption expenditures. So we asked households in the past 7 days what kinds. We went through a list of foods. So we asked whether they consumed them or not, and how much they consumed, and then we valued that food consumption using local prices. And then on top of that, we asked their expenditures on various non-food items with the different types of recalls, 1 month, from 1 month to 12 months, depending on the expenditure category. And this is a standard way of measuring household consumption expenditures, and then to calculate poverty headcounts. And it's also the method that's the World Bank and also the Statistical Agency of Ethiopia uses. Why is poverty increasing? So it seems to be that it's increasing that is due to the reasons that are outside of this project. The context in Ethiopia is very volatile, and in Amhara, for example, there's been an ongoing conflict activity. So it's quite reasonable to assume that these factors are contributing to increased poverty.
Okay, thank you. I see questions are still coming in. I haven't read the most recent, but one that's been waiting is fairly specific. And it's asking, why is egg consumption higher for T3 compared to others? And would that, any info whether that is related to the maternal grants?
Let's see. Okay, so yes, so the difference as I said, the difference between the T2 and 3 arms is the cash transfer. So it's reasonable to assume that the difference, this quite sizable difference in the prevalence of egg consumption between T3 and T2 arms. So if you can't see it, it's in the T1 arm, about 6% of the children were reported to have consumed eggs in the previous day. In T2 arm, it's 9%, and T3 arm is 28%, if I see correctly. Yeah. And so the only difference here between T2 and T3 arms is related to the cash transfer. So it's likely that households are now, with this cash transfer, are able to purchase these eggs that are still quite relatively expensive for these households.
Okay, thank you very much, Kale. I see that we've got someone with their hand raised. I'm not sure. Keshetu, can you?
This is Kanjit. This is
Okay,
Kanjit
yes,
from
please go ahead.
USAID. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And I just want to ask a follow-on question to the poverty measure. That's so for both the treatment arm and the control arm, you know, some of the beneficiaries are new entrants, and and some are like some stayed in the program for a longer period. But like the increase in poverty, even though that's people start receiving the PSMP, the transfers, the consumption smoothing transfers, it's a bit not clear still, you know, like with the additional transfers in the household consumption, why, even though that the poverty increase is a little bit small, it's concerning. Yeah, it's like is it like inflation and conflict? Did you get a chance to analyze more in terms of the why factor, why poverty increased over time?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So and then this type of data and study that is really focused on measuring the impacts using randomized control trial is not very good in analyzing the question that you're raising. So you need to have kind of more detailed questions and different types of sampling to understand what's going on. But you're raising the good point that these are PSMP households, so everyone is receiving the PSMP package. Although some of these households, and we could check the share that are new entrants, but many of these households were already PSMP beneficiaries at the baseline and had been beneficiaries before that. So we could perhaps break the sample along that dimension, but I'm not sure how much statistical power we have to do so. Jessica, Dan, if you have any additions, feel free.
No, I don't think I have that much more to add.
Yeah, Kanjit, hi. It's a good question. I mean, I think I would say we're probably not that surprised though, in the context of all that's going on, that you know, we just don't have a kind of no PSNP control group here, so we can't say anything about, you know, what would have happened for these households had they not received the PSNP. And it may be the case that poverty may have increased more substantially without the PSNP. And in fact, that's probably what we expect. But as Kali said, we don't have the ability to measure it in this sample. But given all that's gone on and the many number of shocks that households have faced, this small increase in poverty is maybe not surprising, as it is disappointing. So thanks.
Okay, thanks each of you. I'm mindful of time and noting that we have another question from Tadele. It's in the chat. And the question is, are there any findings around differences between the two regions of Amhara and Oromia? In reality, there are variations in child feeding practices. For example, animal food sources or animal source foods. Did you see any other differences you can speak to here between the regions?
Yeah, so I can briefly comment on that. We haven't pursued detailed analysis by region. I think we would be concerned that we don't have adequate samples in each region. The study wasn't designed to have adequate samples in each region. It's also not balanced across regions. It's about, the sample is about 2/3 from Oromia. That was a deliberate choice given the security risks associated with fieldwork in Ampara. For intervention implementation, we see very similar findings across regions. So there's the graphs I showed suggestive of high implementation fidelity. That is the same in both regions. I don't believe we've looked at treatment effects across regions. Kali can correct me if I've forgotten.
No.
And your question about animal source food, I assume that the question is whether we see different rates of consumption of animal source food across regions. I'm not sure if we've looked at that.
Yeah, so in other data sets, it's common that across Oromia that animal source food consumption is more prevalent, but again, this also varies within that region. So yeah, I guess we could redo that one graph at least across regions to see what are the differences in this particular sample. But like Jessica said, the study is not really designed for that kind of purpose.
Okay, thank you both. We have one additional question coming in from Tigis. Can you explain why the rate of stunted growth, wasting, and being underweight is higher in group T2 compared to the control group and lower in group T3? If the lower rate in group T3 is due to the treatment component of the intervention, how can you explain the low rate in the control group for these key indicators?
Maybe it's related to this. Jessica, do you want to comment?
Sure. So, I mean, the first point to note is that the differences between T1 and T2 are very small and not significant. So it is true we see that this kind of slight maybe deterioration in T2 versus T1, but we don't interpret that as evidence that the intervention has had detrimental effects, but more as statistical noise. And then we do see, not in this graph, well, we see it on the left, we do see some beneficial effects of treatment in T3. As we've noted, we argue that this reflects the grants. But yes, it is a correct interpretation that right now we don't generally see any substantial effects of the nurturing care groups alone on anthropometric outcomes. I don't think we can argue that there's a negative effect, but there certainly is no positive effect. The low rate in the control arm for these key indicators, I think is consistent with other samples for these indicators, particularly of PSMP households. Kali and Dan, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think that captures it well. So, so when we compare to the national level stunting rates, it's useful to remember that those numbers are always reported for children between 0 to 5 years of age. Our sample is here very focused between children who are 6 months to 24 months of age. And when it comes to stunting and height for height set score, they have a very specific age dynamics. So stunting rates increase quite rapidly between 6 to 24 months of age. And after that, they are higher than for younger children, but they remain also stable. And that's part of the reason why we want to focus the measurement of anthropometric outcomes when it comes to stunting and height for height set score, particularly at the end line when these children are more than 3 years of age, and then that stunting prevalence have, so to speak, stabilized.
Okay, thank you both for those responses. Those were very helpful, as has been this whole presentation. We are at time now, but I want to thank IFPRI for sharing these results and for those of you who joined us today and shared your own questions. If for any reasons you have questions now, or if questions occur to you that we didn't have time to get to, please do share them and we'll forward them to IFPRI and try to get you the best response we possibly can. But again, thanks again for your time today. We hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.